In the midst of crisis, social workers plays a vital role. Thus, there is a need of an appropriate and helpful approach. Hence, in this report, we are going to discuss about crisis intervention approach. First, what is crisis? Accordingly, it is defined as an upset in a steady state, an emotional reaction on the part of an individual, family, or group to a threatening life event, like hazardous events such as floods, typhoons, fire, etc. This emotional reaction can result in a high level of anxiety, feelings of depression and mourning, shame, guilt, anger, hostility, and confusion. To be in a state of crisis means that there is a temporary disturbance in one's equilibrium, characterized by immobilization of problem-solving abilities and other aspects of daily functioning. So tungod atong threatening life events, nahimong dysfunctional ang isa ka tawo, pamilya, or isa ka group. So next, what is crisis intervention? A process for actively influencing the psychosocial functioning of individuals, groups during a period of acute disequilibrium. Kay primarily, a crisis intervention approach used to restore equilibrium during crisis of an individual or family. It involves crisis-oriented, time-limited work, usually 2 to 6 weeks in duration. Kaning approach kay disregard sa usual phases katong 5 kabuok. Kay diri tulo lang ang assessment, implementation o termination, which is later i-discuss sa next reporter. So crisis intervention is a mode of brief treatment that can be used in any social work setting and with any target population under stress. To be effectively, crisis intervention should be available within 24 to 72 hours after application or referral for assistance.
In the Philippines, crisis intervention is being used in admission and emergency wards of hospitals, telephone hotlines, and walk-in centers, women desk in police stations, crisis centers for women and children, drug rehabilitation centers, and in the emergency service of public welfare agencies such as crisis-oriented services to families and groups who are victim of natural disasters. Intake procedures, waiting lines, and the separation of the processes of study, diagnosis, and treatment are not necessarily observed in crisis approach. It is there, but it is not necessarily observed. So, next. Crisis intervention involves a warm, empathic reaching out and what is called a search and find approach. Participation is always voluntary, and the client should be committed to the change process. So it is not compulsory; it is voluntary. However, if you decide to enter, you must be committed throughout the process. So, crisis intervention with families and groups include the following target population. Individuals. First is the individual in the crisis. So those are who are directly in a crisis. Second is those associated with the persons in crisis. So those associated, okay. So third is those in collective crisis. So crisis intervention is for everyone. It is deemed appropriate for people of all ages, ethnic groups, and social classes. The only requirement is that the client should be in a state of crisis or affected or affiliated with the person in crisis, willing to seek help or be referred for help, and be able to sustain a relationship with a helping person for the brief period of the treatment.
In the helping process of crisis, Naomi Golan offers a treatment model for problem-solving theory of casework and which is part of a short-term approach to practice. So, the model divides intervention into three phases, and these are the assessment, the implementation, and determination. In the assessment of situation, this is the first phase in which it involves mainly the evaluation of the five components of the client situation to determine whether the crisis exists or what is the current status. So first is the hazardous events. This is the specific and the stress-producing occurrence that either happens in the external blow or the internal change that occurs both in the individual or in the family. So it is classified into two events. So the first is the anticipated or the predictable. So these two are the normal developmental crisis period in which a person has to take a new rules, learn new tasks, and has to adjust in a new circumstances. For example, getting married or moving into a new place. Second is the anticipated and accidental events. So, muna siya mga unpredictable changes that can happen to anyone. Example, losing someone or sudden introduction of a new person into the social orbit. Also, it can happen to the entire communities. Let's say, for example, natural disaster or the social-political events or the economic environmental catastrophes. Next is the vulnerable or the upset state. So this refers to the subjective reaction of the individual or family. So kita tanan natay mga different reactions or action towards sa isa ka certain situation. And those action may result a anger, shame, guilt, anxiety, depression that could also result to crisis. Next is the precipitating factor or event. So this is the link of the chain of stress, like provoking happenings that bring tension to the peak and convert vulnerable state into one of the crises. So it is also viewed as the presenting problem and thus become the immediate focus for the engagement of the client. Next is the state of active crisis. So this refers to the subjective condition of individual once the tension has stopped. So diri ma-determine whether or not to use the crisis intervention. Last is the state of reintegration or the reorganization. So mo ni siya ang adjustment phase, either it is adaptive and integrative or maladaptive or destructive that takes place as the disequilibrium gradually subside. So in doing the crisis intervention, dapat ang practitioner or the social worker must be clear kung unsa ang iyang goals. So ang mga goals kay number 1, the relief of symptoms, number 2, the restoration to the optimal pre-crisis level of functioning, number 3, understanding of the relevant precipitating events, and number 4, the identification of the remedial measures that can be taken by the client and the family or that are available through the community resources.
So next is the implementation of treatment. So it is all about setting up and working out specific tasks and diri nagasolve daog mga current problems sa ato ang mga client and naga-modify previous inadequate or inappropriate ways of functioning and to learn new coping strategies. The following is the treatment techniques that uses in crisis intervention. So first is the sustaining techniques. So diri dapat mangibabaw ang paghatag og emotional support sa atong client. Diri nato sila gina-encourage og hatagan nato sila og reassurance para mabawasan kung unsa ang ilahang na feel. So second is the direct influence procedure. So diri bura natag naghatag og advice. Diri nato gina-advise nato sila or gihatagan nato og warnings ang atong client kung unsa ang consequences na ilang madawat based sa ilahang current nga situation. So third is the direct intervention. So diri hatagan og direct intervention ang atong mga client kung sila'y plano mag-suicide or nagaplano sila magpakamatay. And tagan po nato sila og direct intervention kung asa ang area nga maka-feel sila og weak. So first is the reflective direction. So as a worker, dapat mag-reflecta kung unsa ang mga diskarte na atong buhaton. Gina-reflect na to ang past nila nga situation ug ang current nila nga situation. So the last is the termination. So diri sa termination, diri nato gina-review ang mga tasks nga atong nahuman and diri nasad nato terminate ang relationship nato sa atong client. And as a worker pod, diri nato gina-review kung naabay progress sa ilang sa atong ginasolve nga problema. And based on what I read on the book, which is the Orange Book, that that Golan points out that sa crisis approach daw kay dapat ang worker is active, purposive, committed, conveying the message that she or he knows kung unsa ang iyang ginabuhat og willing ba ang worker nga mag-take og risk.
So our example of crisis intervention approach is those families who are victims of natural disaster. So the first thing ma social worker do is dapat iyang i-determine ang current situation sa family members. Afterwards, mag-initial interview sa client since i-observe pa ni worker kung unsa jud ang current condition sa family members. Then i-encourage po ni worker na mag-ventilate ang client, which is ang family, it records sa ilang na feel during disaster crisis. So moreover, sa pag-implement sa treatment kay it must be specific since specific man ang pagdetermine sa problem na dapat isolve o dapat immediate since emergency man gud siya nga kanang situation. So according to Golan is sa pag-implement is dapat na aning material arrangement ta. So meaning dapat i-connect ni worker or i-link ni worker si client sa mga available na services na which is very makatabang sa ilaha, such as kining provision of concrete assistance, which is ang kining pabahay, ang social assistance, o ang kining emergency services, o such as crisis-oriented services na to the families who are victims of natural disaster. And aside from that is dapat naasa daw ning psychological task. So it triggers the feelings sa client. So di ba unsa ang na-feel sa each family member during sa disaster crisis na nila experience, di ba? Kaya since it is unpredictable man siya nga situation, no? So diri ay i-apply ni worker or diri mag-exist ang counseling. So therefore, si Golan highlighted that in crisis intervention approach, si social worker must be active since they never work alone in connecting their client to other resources and support system. So nevertheless, the social worker used crisis intervention approach, no, to help individual, group and families who are needs in giving immediate and specific intervention that would be a great help to them specifically in influencing their social functioning.